Order. Question number 2, Andrew Little.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Does he have any financial interests which may affect his decisions around foreign trusts? If so, what are those financial interests?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, no.
Supplementary.
Order. Supplementary question, Andrew Little.
Did he disclose to Cabinet his links to Antipodes Trust Group when making decisions on the review of foreign trusts in New Zealand?
The Right Honourable
Mr
Prime
Speaker,
Minister.
I rely on members knowing about my pecuniary interests.
Order.
No is the answer.
Order. Supplementary question, Andrew Little.
Did he send John Shewan and Don Brash to the Bahamas in 2014 to advise that government on tax matters?
The Right Honourable Prime
Mr.
Minister.
Speaker, yes, I think they went to go and talk to them about GST.
Order. Order.
Supplementary, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, Andrew Little.
Can he confirm that John Shewan and Don Brash advised the Bahamas that its financial services be zero rated for VAT to protect the offshore services industry of that country?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, no, I'm not aware of that level of detail.
Order. Point of order, Andrew Little.
I seek leave to table an article from a Bahamas news outlet, not widely available.
Order.
About
Order. Just a minute. The members seeking leave to table a document, I want to listen to what it is, and if there's interjections coming particularly from my far right quadrant, that makes it difficult. Would the member start his introduction again as to what the document
Mr.
is?
Speaker, I seek leave to table a media report from the Bahamas, not widely available, on the advice given by John Shewan and Don Brash to the Bahamas government to the effect that international financial services be treated as zero rated to protect the so-called domestic financial services.
The document's been well and truly described. I will put the lead and the House will decide. Leave a sought to table that particular media article from the Bahamas. Is there any objection? There is none. It can be tabled. Supplementary question, Andrew Little.
Does he not see there is a fundamental problem with appointing a person to review our foreign trust laws who has advised a government on how to protect its tax haven status?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
The member has proven over the last 2 weeks he's completely unfit to judge who's a tax haven or not.
Order. That is a straight personal reflection on the member that's asked the question, and that will be ruled out of order. Would the Prime Minister stand now and answer the question? Well, I haven't heard the answer. Supplementary question. Order. I haven't heard the answer, so I'm going to invite the member to re-ask the question so that I can hear the answer.
Mr. Speaker, does he not see there is a fundamental problem with appointing a person to review our foreign trust laws who has advised a government on how to protect its tax haven status?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I can't confirm whether the Bahamas is a tax haven or not. I don't simply know. But I don't think the member would know either.
Supplementary question, Andrew Little.
How can New Zealanders have any confidence in his judgment as Prime Minister on tax-dodging foreign trusts when he has links to Antipodes Trust Group, a company specialising in foreign trusts?
It's a very marginal question as to whether there's a Prime Ministerial responsibility.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I fully have disclosed my positions, as is quite clear. I'm not going to go into those because I have no Prime Ministerial responsibility for them, but I'm quite confident that I understand my positions and I'm quite confident they're above board.
Supplementary.
What about the old
Order. Supplementary question, Andrew Little.
Why, in answer to my question yesterday where I said, quotes, has he ever been involved personally or professionally in a foreign trust or other vehicle used to reduce tax, did he fail to disclose his links with Antipodes Trust Group, a business that specialises in foreign trusts?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not involved in a foreign trust.
True.
Supplementary question, Andrew Little. Order. Supplementary question, Andrew Little.
Why?
Order. On the front bench of the National Party, order. Andrew Little.
Why is his trust run by a firm that specialises in helping the mega wealthy set up foreign trusts to dodge tax?
Order, no, order. In that particular case, that question is definitely out of order. There is no prime ministerial responsibility. I can clarify my ruling there if it would help if there's any further supplementaries, but individual members are not responsible for the register of pecuniary interests. That is a thing that all members of Parliament are required to comply with. However, ministers are responsible for their management of conflicts of interest. Where there is a potential conflict of interest with the minister's portfolio interests, then there is a legitimate ground for questioning, and I refer members to Speaker's ruling 1721. A minister may be asked about financial or other interests only insofar as it involves potential conflicts of interest relating to his or her portfolios. And in the case of the Prime Minister, there is a responsibility for every portfolio, but he still only has ministerial responsibility for potential conflicts of interest. I would also take this opportunity of drawing members' attention to Speaker's ruling 1714, which states that a question whose sole purpose is to pry into a member's private affairs is not in order. The Cabinet Manual makes it clear that ministers do have additional requirements in respect to personal interests because of the influence and power they can exercise. Ministers are responsible for identifying, reviewing and managing conflicts of interest, and that is a legitimate subject for questioning in the House today or any day. The member may want to rephrase that question. Andrew Little.
Thank you.
Supplementary question, Andrew Little.
Speaker, how can New Zealanders have any confidence in his judgment as Prime Minister and the management of his conflicts of interest when days after appointing somebody to investigate into our foreign trust and tax dodging laws, he discloses he has money deposited with Antipodes Trust Group, given that that arrangement is not standard practice for the management of trusts?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it is standard.
Order. Supplementary question, Andrew Little.
Can he give New Zealanders a cast iron assurance in relation to the management of his conflicts of interest that the money he has with Antipodes is not associated with any vehicle designed to avoid tax?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I've made it quite clear. It's money that's held in my name that's in with the New Zealand Trading Bank. It's no different to anybody else, and any lawyer around New Zealand pretty much does trust work.
Get someone to explain.
Supplementary.
Order. Supplementary question, Andrew Little.
In relation to that last question and the management of the Prime Minister's conflicts of interests, given his trust lawyers say, quotes, client information is kept strictly confidential, reporting requirements are limited and the identity of the settlor and beneficiaries need not be disclosed, why does he still say that New Zealand has full disclosure of information in relation to its foreign trust law?
The Right Honourable Prime
Mr.
Minister.
Speaker, because it doesn't. Actually, interesting enough, a specialist trust firm is subject to Part 1 of the anti-money laundering rules. They have to know both the source of client, they're subjected to 2 yearly reviews, and they're subjected to full disclosure of any information that's asked of them with countries that have either a double tax agreement or an information sharing agreement. Actually, they are the creme de la creme of basically making sure that there's proper disclosure.
It's so good.
Supplementary question, Andrew Little.
Has he ever had any links to any companies or other financial vehicles that are used to reduce tax?
I don't see a Prime Ministerial responsibility in that question. Point of order. 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 Chris Hipkins, point of order.
Mr. Speaker, I think as you've made it very clear in your ruling, the entire line of questioning has been around potential conflicts of interest for the Prime Minister. And I think it's perfectly legitimate for the Leader of the Opposition to be testing that.
Order. No, I just ruled I think the member's right about most of the questions, but he's not right about that question. There was no mention about potential conflicts of interest as I heard the question. Point of order.
It is a different point of order.
Just to clarify, we had an issue yesterday where I asked the member whether he was raising a fresh point of order, and he said it was. I reviewed it, and it certainly was not. And I do get a bit impatient when we continue to relitigate matters. Now, if the member does have a fresh point of order, I'm happy to hear it. But if it's in any way questioning whether I've just made the right call in saying that question was in order or out, that is then just questioning me as a speaker, and that in itself is very disorderly. Well, no, I have a point of order here first, or do I not? Point of order from the Honourable David Parker.
I believe it is, sir, and I accept your comment about yesterday. Sir, the Prime Minister, to the New Zealand public and to this Parliament, quite often relies upon his expertise in banking and his experience as an international member of that industry prior to election to justify his expertise and his views on matters. So the flip side of that is when we come to other issues that relate to international banking, the history of the Prime Minister's experience is relevant to the views that he has, and if it's relevant on the positive side, sir, I suggest that the opposition must have some latitude in respect of exploring issues where those same ethics, well, I don't mean to impugn
bring the
ethics
point to an end, please.
Those same factual bases become relevant from another point of view.
And I'll hear from the Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, the questions from the Leader of the Opposition have been in relation to conflict of interest about a foreign trust. I've never had a foreign trust. I do not have a foreign trust, and therefore I cannot have a conflict of interest with one.
Order. Does the member have a further supplementary?
Yes, one more.
Oh, further supplement. Well, unless I'm required to rule on Mr Parker's point, but I would simply say that I have, in my opinion, given latitude to the Leader of the Opposition throughout his questioning, apart from one at the very end, which I am comfortable I've ruled out of order and should have done so because, in my opinion, it was prying into matters for which there was no Prime Ministerial responsibility. Further supplementary question, Andrew Little.
Mr Speaker, does he think that he can properly manage his conflicts of interests as Prime Minister if he does not give New Zealanders a cast-iron assurance that he has had no links to any companies or other financial vehicles that are used to reduce tax?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Just answer that in my point I made earlier. I've never had a foreign trust, and I pay my fair share of tax.
Order. 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 I don't want to have to mention the name of the member twice in 2 days. Supplementary question, Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Referring to his statement that New Zealand is not a tax haven, is the Antipodes Trust Group Limited a foreign trust operation or a domestic trust operation?
Order. There is no Prime Ministerial responsibility for that at all. That is about the Minister's pecuniary, the member's pecuniary interest. I made a ruling on that earlier. Point of order, the Right Honourable.
It is not about his pecuniary interests. I'm asking about a status of an operation that he is familiar with because of his connection with the Chief Executive and lawyer, namely the man that set it up.
Order.
Now, that's not a matter of pecuniary interest. I want to know.
I listened carefully to the question and it did not meet the requirements that I established quite clearly during question time today. Point of order, the Right Honourable.
We are going to get at the truth of this matter. I want to know, with a point of clarity from you, what is the offence that I am engaging in here if I'm asking for the status of a trust operation that is now out in the media and known by everybody?
Because I have just ruled that that's a matter associated with the member's pecuniary interest return, and as I said earlier, that is a responsibility for every member of Parliament in this place. It is not something for which there is a specific Prime Ministerial responsibility. Question number 3, James.